Welcome back, everyone. Dan Vega here, Spring Developer Advocate at VMware. Today we're going to be talking about observability in Spring Framework 6 and Spring Boot 3 and beyond. Now, there were four major themes that went into Spring Boot 3. There was first the Java 17 baseline, the Jakarta EE upgrade, the AOT transformations, and observability. And the important thing to note is what went into Spring Boot 3, Spring Framework 6 when it comes to observability was really just the start of this new observability story. There will be additions to this in the future, but for now, let's talk about what is there. And how are we going to do this? I want to cover three things. I want to talk about what, why, and how. Let's start with the what. Observability is a way for us to gain insights into our applications based on the outputs. Now, these outputs can be things like logging, metrics, and distributed tracing. Distributed tracing is something that we had to bring in external dependencies before. Now that's kind of built into the framework. Next, let's talk about why we need it. So I talked about this in a previous video into the Spring Boot Actuator. It's not enough to build out our systems locally, run all of our tests, and then just push them out to production and do one of these. We need to be proactive. We need to have some insights into what our application is doing, how it's performing in production, so we can be proactive to help our customers out. Again, systems are complex today. They are no longer these kind of single systems, right? Especially in organizations where we have distributed architecture, and we may have to call 3 to 5 different systems to get all of the data that we need. If you don't have monitoring in place, you're not going to know where these things are going wrong. So this is very, very important. All right, so that's the why, that's the what. Let's talk about the how. We're going to build a new project today. We'll head over to start.spring.io. We'll create just a simple web project, and then we'll go ahead and add some, we'll add the actuator in. We'll add in Zipkin, which allows us to view these traces that are going on underneath the hood for us. And we'll just talk through a couple scenarios. We'll look at what the framework itself is observing and what it may not be observing. And then we'll talk about creating our own observations. So we get to take advantage of the same observation API that the framework is using underneath the hood. And again, I can't stress this enough. This is really kind of the beginning of this new observation story that is going to continue throughout the 3.x releases. So with that, I think we're going to have some fun today. I hope you learned something new. With that, let's write some code. All right, we're going to get started by heading over to start.spring.io. We're going to create a new project here using Maven, Java, and we'll go ahead and select the latest milestone release of Spring Boot 3.2, only because I'm going to bring in the REST client. I'm going to go ahead and say that our group is dev.danvega. We'll go ahead and name this artifact Observability Demo. And we'll need a few dependencies for this. So for those dependencies, we're going to go ahead and choose web. We're also going to go ahead and choose the actuator. We talked about this in the last video. This is what really brings in all of the production ready support. And because we have the actuator, we're going to start collecting some metrics and traces behind the scenes. And then we need a way to go ahead and view some of those. So I'm going to choose Zipkin. This enables us to expose those span and trace IDs to Zipkin. And one more thing, I'm going to bring in the Docker Compose support. This is because I don't have Zipkin running locally, so it's going to create a Docker Compose file. We can see that by going to Explore and seeing the Compose file, and it will go ahead and set up a Zipkin service for me. That means if I go ahead and download this project or somebody else does, they can just run it and we'll have a local version of Zipkin running that they can go ahead and test everything out with. So I think that's it for now. We're going to bring in security and AOP later, but we'll get into that when we get to that point. I want to do this without security first, and then we'll see some of the metrics that Spring Security is exposing for us as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and generate this project. We'll go ahead and download that project as in a zip format. I will go ahead and open this up in my favorite IDE, IntelliJ IDEA. You can open it up in whatever IDE or text editor you're most productive in. All right, so we need something to observe. Let's go ahead and build out a small application. I'm going to start with the home package. I'm going to create a new home controller. We'll say home controller. This home controller is a REST controller, and we're just going to set something up so that we have a get mapping to the root. So from there, we'll just say public string home, return hello world. That's fine. This is going to come into play when we bring in some Spring Security and we need routes that are open and routes that are protected. And so we'll take a look at that then. So I'm going to create one more package. We're going to call this the post package. And inside of post, we're going to create a new record called post. And in this record, we're going to have an integer ID, an integer user ID, a string title, and a string body. Now, if you're familiar with this record, it's because we've used it before. We're going to line this up with a service called the JSON placeholder service so that we can talk to a public API. So for this to work, next I'm going to need a controller. So I'm going to create a new controller here, and we'll call this post controller. This is going to be a REST controller. This is going to have a request mapping of /API/posts. And then we need a way to get all of the posts. So on the root there, we'll say that we're going to get a list of posts. We'll call this find all. Now to find all, I'm going to need something to talk to that service. So to do that, I'm going to create a new Java class. We'll call this the JSON placeholder service. This is going to be an interface. And this is using the new feature in Spring Boot 3 called HTTP interfaces, declarative HTTP clients, if you will. I've done some videos on this in the past, so go ahead and look for those in the description below. So really quick, we'll just annotate this with the, oops, wrong one. I've done that before, get exchange. So this is going to be /posts. This is going to return a list of posts, and this is going to be called find all. And then we'll have one for a get exchange of posts ID. Then we'll say post find by ID. That integer ID is going to be dynamic. So we need to pull that out using the pass variable. So that's it. That is our interface. To be able to use this interface, we just need to write a little boilerplate code to kind of get this set up. So I'm going to come in. I can put this anywhere, really. I'm just going to do this in application. I can put this in any kind of configuration class anywhere. And the reason I can do this in application is because Spring Boot application is annotated with an Spring Boot configuration, which is annotated with @configuration. So that makes the application class somewhere that we could put configuration, and we will scan for beans. We'll find this bean, pick it up, and put it in the application context. So I'm going to say I need to create a bean, and this bean is going to be of type JSON placeholder service. We'll call this JSON placeholder service. And no, we are not going to return a new JSON placeholder service because that is an interface. We can't do that. What we need to do is we're going to start off with the REST client. So the REST client is new in Spring Boot 3.2. I've done a video on this if you're interested in that. And yes, Copilot, this is looking pretty good. I want to create a REST client with a base path to this JSON placeholder service. So this is the base. And then when we get into our JSON placeholder service, /posts is going to give us that. That's the URI to get all of the posts. So once I have a REST client, I want to say HTTP service proxy factory. I want to say builder 4. And then the builder 4 can take a REST client adapter. That looks good. Yes. Is that right? Okay, that's right. I want a variable from that. We'll call this the factory. That looks good. And now all we need to do is return the factory dot create client. There is it. There we go. Oops. Why didn't I call it factory? That will work. All right. So that will return us an instance of the JSON placeholder service. And once we have that, we can use that in the controller now. So let's go back to our controller and we will go ahead and say, yes, Copilot, you are on your game today. Let's add a constructor parameter to get that through constructor injection. Now we can go ahead and use that here and say JSON placeholder service dot find all. So if that's the case, this looks pretty good so far. Again, we're not using a database here. We don't want to kind of overcomplicate things. Let's just see if we can go ahead and fire up this application and then hit localhost 8080 /API/posts. And then what that should do is call out to the public API and return 100 posts, because there are 100 posts in that dummy API, if you will. So I'm going to use HTTPIE And I can do that. It's just like curl, but a little bit more readable. And I could say /API/posts. And there we go. We get our 100 records. So cool. We know that our client, our wiring up of the service worked. And again, the great thing about HTTP interfaces is we didn't have to write any boilerplate code. Okay, so we're getting there. We're almost there. Let's just go ahead and write one more method in our controller. So this is going to be a get mapping, and we just need to get the ID. So this is going to be dynamic. So we'll say data.id. And then here we're just going to say we're going to return. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Thank you, Copilot. So this is all working. And now we want to make sure that we have some observation in place. And the really great thing about this is Spring Framework is observing a lot of things behind the scenes for us. Things like the REST template, the web client. In a newer version of Spring Framework, the REST client is now being collecting metrics. They're watching for things like on the controller. If a controller action happens, it is able to kind of log that request. So a lot of things are going on behind the scenes. So right now, we don't have to do anything. What we do have to do is we have to go into our application.properties. And I want to just set a couple things. I want to enable all of the web endpoints. So I'm going to say web include star. I also like to go ahead and show the details for the health endpoint. And then what's happening behind the scenes is there's this management.tracing sampling probability. I believe the probability is in the range from 0.0 to 1.0 that traces will be sampled. It looks like the default is 0.1. We want to actually set this to 1.0 because we want to make sure, especially in a development environment, we want to make sure that we are collecting metrics for every single request that's going on. Because again, we're testing this out. Now, you may not want to do that in production, but at least for development, we want to make sure that we're doing that. So I'm going to do that. And then one more thing here in the compose file. I have some problems with this sometimes. I map 9.4.11 to 9.4.11, and we should be good there. So let's go ahead and restart our application. All right, so the first thing I'll do is head over to localhost 8080. That will print out that hello world for us. Next, I'm going to go ahead and visit API/posts. That will go ahead and visit all of the posts. So you can see there's 100 here. And again, this is coming from a public API called the JSON placeholder service. And then we'll just go ahead and pick one of these out. Let's say 24, and that will give us a single post. So I made those 3 requests because we're starting to collect data about those requests behind the scenes. Where is that data going? Let's go over and take a look at the actuator. So we're going to visit /actuator. And if we go into Actuator, we've enabled all the endpoints. We talked about this in a previous video. So if you want to learn more about the Actuator and why I think it's the #1 Spring Boot starter you should include in every single project, go ahead and check that video out. There's one endpoint we kind of skipped over, and I skipped over it because I wanted to cover it here, and that is the metrics. So if we go into metrics, based on whatever type of application we're building, we're going to be collecting different metrics here. You see there's nothing in here about Spring Security. That's because we don't have Spring Security on the class path. Once we do, we'll start collecting more metrics on this. So there's going to be one in here. If we go ahead and look here, there's one called HTTP service requests. So now if we go to /metrics/HTTP service requests, if we were to actually spell that right, Dan, that would go ahead and print out all of the HTTP requests that we're collecting behind the hood. So there are currently 7. Here's the total time, the max, any exceptions. Here's the URIs. So we know we went to that. We went to post. We went to post ID, actuator, etc. Here's some statuses. So the one we just did was a 404, and so on. So we're collecting all of these things behind the hood, which is really great to see. And this is just one example of it. If we go back over here, we're collecting things on the HTTP requests, the JVM, Tomcat, all of those things that are happening. We can use these metrics to kind of build out some dashboards to give us some insight into our application. Now, we've done one other thing. We actually included Zipkin, so Zipkin should be up and running. So if we go to 9411, that's what Zipkin runs on by default, we get this nice dashboard where we can start searching through traces. Now, we haven't had a lot, so I don't need to get well-defined here on what traces to look for. I can just go ahead and run the query and find all of them. But you could use this interface to kind of search through them and look for a specific one. So here's HTTP GET for API/posts. I'm going to go ahead and show that. And you can see in here we get some information about that. How long did it take? 363 milliseconds. We can see that there are how many services? 1. There's a depth of 1, a total span of 1. Here's that trace ID. There are ways to get these trace IDs or span IDs into the logging, if you will, too. If that's interesting to you, go ahead and take a look at the documentation. We can also see there's a span ID here. The parent ID is none. So this becomes important if, for an instance, you're in a controller, you make a request to one service and then to another service, aggregate those results together and display those to the caller or the client. That becomes important because now you can see in here what that looks like, what the total kind of trip looks like, if you will. So then we can see down here, there's no tags. We have a success outcome. Here's the 200. Here's the URI, right? So this gives us all of the information we need to know about that request. That's really great. Let's go back to traces. Let's run this again. Let's look at this particular one. Same thing. We get some information about this. So this is great. We're collecting these metrics behind the scenes, and we're off and running. And we didn't have to really do anything in the post controller because Spring is observing the post controller by default. Now, what about code that we write? What if we want to take advantage of this observation API? Well, there is a way to do that. So first I want to show the code not working, and then we'll see that how we can go ahead and adjust that. So here in my application, I'm going to do something. I'm going to create a bean. We'll call this a command line runner. And the command line runner is something that, yeah, this looks good, Copilot. I might do this to kind of load some initial data into a database, for example, right? So this will run after the application context has started, which means we have access to our JSON placeholder service, which means I could go ahead and say, hey, find me all of the posts. So that would reach out to that public API, get me 100 posts back. I could then use some type of repository to insert those into the database. But all I'm going to do is actually make this call here. And the reason I want to do this is because I want to show you. Let's go ahead and let's do one more thing here. I'm just going to get a logger, and I'm going to go ahead and say log.info, and I'm going to say all posts. Let's just get the JSON. No. Here, let's do this .var. Great. Okay, so now we're going to log out how many posts were there. So let's go ahead and rerun the application. We should see posts. There should be 100 of them. And there we go. So now let's go back over to Zipkin this time. We'll go to find traces, and we run this query, and we run this query, we run this query. There's nothing there. And that's because we are not automatically observing every single thing that happens in the application. There are certain times that you're going to need to provide some code to say, hey, this is something I want to observe. And that's where the observation API comes in. Now, there's two flavors of this. There's one where we can sprinkle in some code, and then there's the observed aspect, which we can use. So I'm going to start with kind of doing this manually. So to do this, you need a bean of type observation registry. That gets wired in for us automatically. Spring is creating one of those for us, so we don't need to create that ourselves. I don't know why it does this with the code. Is that right? Okay, so once we have the observation registry, now we can use the observation here to say, I want you to create an observation, but don't start it just yet. And what is it going to be? It's going to be, let's say, posts.load all posts, right? And the reason we needed that observation registry is because it takes the observation registry here. So we're going to pass in a low cardinality key value. So there's a low and a high. You can look at the documentation for the difference. One is collected on both. The low is collected, I believe, on both the metric and the trace, whereas one is just collected on the trace. So there's a low cardinality key value, there's a high cardinality key value, there's a contextual name, and then the observe is what are we actually observing? What is the code we want to pay attention to? So in this case, we're observing that call to the JSON placeholder service find all. Now again, this might be a moot point if you're using like 3.2, the real like stable version in the future, because we'll be instrumenting the REST client. But this is just an example of some code that we are not observing right now that we can kind of add our own observation into. So let's go ahead and restart this. And at this point, it's going to make a call out. Again, I could have, I just want to show you this too. We could have done something. So this takes a supplier. We could have done something like this. And then we could have done something like that. So we can use the supplier there. We could still do our logging if we want to. So this will all work out. So now if I go over, again, I didn't do anything. All that was going to do is run after the application starts up. If I go ahead and run my query, we now see that post service find all. Why is that post service find all? I think let's just say post load all posts, right? So either way, that's there. So now you can go in and click show, and now you get some observations around that. Now, this is great. This works. But what if I don't need a lot of detail here, and I really just want to tell Spring, hey, observe this particular method and give it some type of name? How can we do that? So the way that we're going to do that is I'm going to return to just this thing. So let's come back to where we were before. So this is all we're doing here. And what I can do now is I'm going to go back to my pom.xml. I'm going to add a new dependency here. So we're going to say dependency. And again, you could have selected this from the starter, from the start.spring.io, but I wanted to do this after the fact. So Spring Boot Starter ALP, and we're going to go ahead and import that. Let's just make sure that that got pulled in. And now what I can do is I can come in here and say, I want you to go ahead and observe this using the @observed annotation. Now, this happened to be something that you had to add some other configuration for in the past. In Spring Boot 2 milestone 1, this was added as an auto configuration. So as long as ALP is on the class path, this will go ahead and work, which is really great. I don't need this for now. Let's just add a contextual name. And cool, that looks good. Cool. So now what I can do is I don't actually need this observation registry. All I did was add an annotation to this. And I think this will work if we go ahead and rerun this application. Now we've kind of just added an annotation with some information about this observation instead of sprinkling it within our code. So let's go back to trace, and there it is. We didn't have to kind of write that code in there. So cool. That was kind of two sides of it. Being able to hook into the observability API, which again, the framework's using underneath the hood, we get advantage. We're able to take advantage of that same API by using the observation API, whether it's through writing the code like we did using create not started, or using the @observed annotation. Now I just want to show you one more thing. If we come back in here, and let's go ahead and add a new dependency here. So let's come back here and say Spring, whoops, what am I doing, Dan? Spring Boot Starter Security. Oh, not an error. There we go. And let's make sure that that's getting imported. And now what I want to do is I will go ahead and add some security here. I just need to add a little bit of configuration. So in a package called security, I'm going to add a new Java class called security config. This is a configuration class. We will enable come on, Dan. Enable web security. So this is not happening because we must not have pulled in the right dependency. Okay, that's not right. So let's do that. Okay, let's name that right. Maybe that would help. Okay, that looks good. Now we should be able to enable web security, and I'm just going to paste in some configuration here just to save us a little bit of time. We've done some videos on Spring Security in the past, so let's just go ahead and bring that in. So all we're doing is we're permitting all on the root path, that home controller we set up. We're also allowing all on Actuator, and then anything else should be authenticated using a form login. So I'm going to refresh this, and the only reason I want to do this is I just kind of want to show you that different projects will add different things to observations, right? And it really just depends what you're using. So if we go over here to localhost 8080, we do not need a username and password. What if we go to Actuator? We don't need a username and password. So what if we go to Actuator and metrics? Then if we go in here, and now we'll start to see, oh, there's a whole bunch of Spring Security things going on. So this is great. Now we're starting to collect metrics on Spring Security. What happens if I go over to /API/posts? Now we get that form login. I'll go ahead and log in as me. Once I log in, I can see the posts. And now that I've done that, I want to go back to Zipkin, run this query. And if we look in here on something like /API/posts, now not only are we getting our traces here on the /API/posts, but we can see the kind of request path that it took. Like, hey, this is a secured request. This is an authorized request. Here's the security filter chain before. So everything that it goes through, it's going and adding those different metrics to it, and we're able to view that here in this trace. So I just wanted to add Spring Security in to kind of show that bit, but that's really what I wanted to cover with observation, the new Observability API in Spring Boot 3. Really, again, just kind of the start of the story. All the different projects are adding bits to observation. So we saw with Spring Security. I've done some demos on GraphQL before. If you bring in GraphQL, we're adding some observation there as well. So really cool to see kind of this unified observation API being used across the portfolio of Spring projects. So pretty excited with this. Hope you learned something today. If you did, do me a favor, friends. Go ahead and leave me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and as always, happy coding.